I'm your host, Lindsay Foreman, and today joining me, I'm very excited to introduce David Mathisen. He is the author of several books. One in particular that I really want to get into today is Myths and Trauma, The High Self and Ancient Wisdom and Their Enemies, which I'm really excited about hearing about your book. David, you are a dot maker, of the stars and myths mixed with religion and spirituality. And I've heard you talk, and I'm very fascinated. And I love the way that you put it all together to where it makes sense for people that don't even understand or haven't studied astrology at all. So I think that what you have to say resonates so clearly because there's so much truth behind it. So I'm really excited to have you. So yeah, I'm going to have you. I would love for you to introduce yourself and then get into your book.
Well, thanks very much for having me, Lindsay. It's a privilege to talk to you. Congratulations on your podcast. And I've been researching this path that I've been going down for over a decade now, and it is not even a conclusion that I was looking for when I started out, that the stories in the Bible are based on the stars, because I was taking the Bible literally, but I was very interested in the evidence that the ancient myths are based on the stars. That's where I started, was looking at the ancient myths. I've always loved the myths since I was little. I've always loved the stars since I was little. And when I saw in Hamlet's Mill, which is a book that I talk about a lot, which was published in 1969, this argument that the world's ancient wisdom, including the stories and the myths, but also their systems of measurement, their systems of number, their systems of music, was all part of this worldwide whole that was connected around the world. That was really fascinating to me. And they sometimes would also talk about the Bible stories being based on the same system, which I was initially very resistant to. But the evidence is really overwhelming. So the myths of virtually every culture on our planet can be shown to be based on this worldwide system of celestial metaphor. And that includes the Greek myths, myths from ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, the stories in the Bible, the Norse myths, myths from the Americas, the different cultures like the Maya, also the nations of the North American nations, the First Nations, the Pacific, stories from the cultures of the Pacific, which was a vast area. It was covered by the cultures of the Pacific from Hawaii all the way to New Zealand, which is the largest single area of any one culture that shared a language and shared myths. Those stories are based on the same system. Africa, Australia, China, Japan.
Yeah, it's on every continent and every religion and it's in philosophy. I mean, once you start listening to what you're saying, you really kind of see it everywhere. And it's funny because, you hear like Native Americans call each other the star people, or the star people came and gave him this information, and how we're made of stardust. And there's, and to me, I'm wondering your take, and we can get into this now or later, but even kind of making astrology silly, or looking up to the stars. Like, we knew in ancient times, everyone's scratching their heads trying to figure out how they had all this knowledge. But it makes sense that they've been passed down through these stories, through myths and folklore, or biblical and religious stories, and that they're all so interconnected. Everybody has a very similar story of creation. Everybody has a similar story of like a divine being coming showing the way, like, the Son of God, or this divine that kind of created the path. And it's all stories really that we hold all inside of ourselves. It's like the story of the universe is the story of ourselves and what we go through, of how we get into our high selves, or going down into, the depths of hell, or dealing with demons. And so I just think it's extremely fascinating. So
Yeah, that was really well said. There's a quote that I like to use pretty often from Alvin Boyd Kuhn, who says, the stories are not about ancient kings and queens and heroes and princesses. The stories are about each and every man and woman until the reader sees himself or herself as the center of the myth. You're not grasping its, I'm paraphrasing what he's saying, but
no, but it's
he
true.
says, until you see that it's really about you, the story is not about some figure, Samson. I like to use Samson, the strongest man who ever lived, right? Samson could kill a lion with his bare hands. He could, bring down a building on top of his head at the end of the story by pushing the pillars apart. And if that's just a story about, okay, well, Samson was given great strength and he lived, I don't know, 3,500, 4,000 years ago, what does that have to do with me or you? I'm not the strongest man who ever lived, or Solomon, I'm not the wisest man who ever lived. But when you understand that actually this story is talking about you, then it's not external anymore. And
Right.
so when you see that these stories are based on celestial metaphor, and I'll show some examples of that, but it is really undeniable. When I say they're based on celestial metaphor, I mean those figures in the stories and the episodes can be seen in the stars, can be shown to be based on the stars. Well, that means it's not about a literal Samson, a literal person outside of you who lived in a certain place and time and had certain characteristics that you and I don't share. It's actually about us. It's about certain aspects of our life that we run into, and it's got a message that is pertinent to this very present moment that we're in right now at any
Yeah,
given
it's so
time.
applicable to all of what we're going through. It's like the journey that we're all on, but so many people I think are like in the matrix so hard, or in this illusional self, or in the ego self, because like this realm is nothing but to keep you away from discovering that, right? It's like it's always stroking your ego, whether it's to make you feel superior or inferior or jealous or better than somebody. It's always meant to keep you outside of yourself. And I was doing this podcast with Mark, and I was telling him I have this theory, and I don't think I came up with it because I think we all share this, like when you're getting downloads or whatever, it's been thought of a billion times, but that it really is, it's almost like religion and all of this of what we're being told, the illusion is to place all this blame for your life on God and to keep you as far away from discovering that God is within you as much as humanly possible. It's like, I remember reading, because I had a very religious background. My father was very religious, very theologian, dogma. So I kind of went the opposite way. But I remember when I kind of started coming back into reading about spirituality and self-healing, I read the story. What is it? It's not the, oh, of course, I can't think of it right now but anyway, it's the story of Jesus, and it's A Course in Miracles. And the whole thing talks about and breaks down that this is within you. Like, we hold this power within us. It's not some mythical figure that lives outside of us that we're never going to attain. And that's kind of what religion teaches you, that no matter what you do, you're never going to be good enough because you are a sinner at heart. And I think that is the illusion that keeps people like turned off from really delving into discovering God from within and discovering themselves from within.
Right. So the thing that you said earlier about we're also in this matrix and it's here to separate us from ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
When you were saying that, I was thinking, yeah, but somehow we have all these myths. So somewhere even in the ancient times, this message was understood to be necessary,
Right.
right? If it was already in the Gilgamesh epic, the very oldest basically story that we have access to on these clay tablets from Mesopotamia, um, is about, I argue in Myth and Trauma that you referenced, that these ancient myths, one of their central purposes is to help heal that separation from the self. So if the matrix is here to separate us from ourselves, inside we have, inside every culture, we have these original instructions. There's an author named Peter Kingsley, whose work I like very much, and he says every culture was given original instructions, but unfortunately we've lost our original instructions, or those instructions have been taken away from us. But those original instructions, actually, one of their central messages is the repair, the recovery of that loss of who we are, the loss of self. So they must have known, whoever gave these to humanity must have known that that is a message that we will always need. And I think it's at the heart of so many problems that we have today. There's so much depression. I mean, serious depression. There's the percentage of people who are taking drugs for depression or
mental illness.
Mental illness.
Anxiety.
Anxiety. That's the word I was looking for. So those are some cutting edge healers, psychologists that I'm sure you've heard me talk about, like Dr. Richard Schwartz, Dr. Gabor Mate, Dr. Peter Levine, talk about trauma and the effect of trauma of separating us from our own self, the self that we have, everyone has. And these problems of addictions and depressions and anxiety stem from separation from the self. They're manifestations. ADHD is a manifestation of not being able to be alone with yourself. Yeah. And there's good reasons why we develop these defense mechanisms which suppress the self. It's a response to things that are in the society around us, especially when we're very young, and we suppress the self, and then we develop these guardians to keep the self locked down there and keep it from coming back to the surface. And the myths talk about going down and reconnecting, and that the self is actually indestructible. It's actually immortal. It is like a god that goes down to the underworld and cannot be destroyed. It can be hung up on a hook, like there's a Babylonian, actually ancient Sumerian myth of Inanna, the goddess who goes down into the underworld, and as she goes through the gates of the underworld, she has to take off one garment of her glorious attire after another until she's totally naked in front of the gods of the dead, and then they hang her up on a hook and turn her into a corpse, but she comes back. So it's like even the most horrendous stripping away cannot stop Inanna from coming back. And the same thing, the Jesus story follows the same pattern. In fact, she's hung up on a hook for 3 days. The Osiris story, he goes down into the underworld, and then Isis has to look all over the world and find him and bring him back. And that is an image of this indestructible self, which cannot be. Dr. Richard Schwartz talks about this, and we can talk about his therapy system that is so amazing. I didn't even run across these sorts of things until after I'd been writing about the myths being based on the stars. But when I saw the things that they're saying, it resonates so clearly with what the myths are teaching, that these are therapists who have dealt with thousands and thousands of men and women and talked to them and said, I was astonished that someone who'd gone through that kind of trauma would have that self that seems so indestructible. You know, we were taught in psychology school and med school that you had to have kind of a supportive upbringing to develop those kinds of confidence and courage and curiosity and calm. And yet it's in there in everybody. Everybody has this indestructible self. And that's, I think, I'm convinced that's what the myths are actually pointing us towards, how we recover that.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly believe that's what I'm saying is like this realm, though, is giving you the trauma. And so then they're giving you the key on how to save yourself. And I think that once you turn to that and see that you have to go within and not without, then all the answers, like, I shouldn't say all the answers, but things start aligning like the stars, like things start lining up. You start coming across all this information, and it all maybe in the beginning seems really kind of abstract. And as you get closer and closer, I think, and deeper in healing and letting go of the trauma, it becomes more solidified, and it's stronger. And you realize that it really is like the jewel of knowledge that is in every single myth of how to save yourself. And I can totally, relate. It's like you don't know how strong you are until you go to the depths of hell and pull yourself out. And then when you come back with, if you don't look back and you realize that you are that strength, then you come back stronger than than ever before, but that's what you needed to gain that strength. And I really feel like, with I think you're gonna the man you're talking about does psychedelics, is that correct? With working with the ego. And I think it's the ego that is constantly convincing you because you're fragmented with trauma. And those fragmentations, I think a lot of people, like, I'll go a weirder step, is I think they're vibrating on a frequency where like entities mess with them, right? And because they're in trauma. And I think that whatever those entities are, like the demonic entities or demons or your own demons, are just feed off of that frequency. And when you are vibrating on that, whether you're aware of it or not, I think a lot of people are bombarded with their own demons. Like, it's a mirror, it's showing you that that is what you hold with inside of yourself. And I think doing a lot of shadow work and stuff with the ego and psychedelics is like the way of the future. I work with people with sound frequencies and with like shamanic work, and I think that understanding that you hold the key, you are the divine self that you're tapping into, you are your high self, and that it's you connect your spiritual world with your heart self, and then you're navigating it in this 3D world. But I feel like our job is to connect that spirit world and manifest into this life, into this 3D realm.
Right.
So,
And I would agree that if it's in all of the myths, then probably this is necessary in every culture. But what I would say is that it's pretty clear you can have a more traumatic culture, a more trauma-inducing way of raising children, or a less trauma-inducing way of raising children. You can have a society that is more conducive to people living from tapping into self, and you can
mhm.
have a society that is more conducive to fragmenting people. Uh, and it's pretty clear that there have been cultures, and there are still people that we know where we say, wow, that person is so centered and so grounded and so comfortable in their own skin, and I wonder how they got that way. But that's not the norm anymore. And I would say it's getting worse. We can look at statistics and see that it's getting worse. But if you think of, so Dr. Gabor Mate does work with psychedelics, and he talks about hunter-gatherer cultures where you're not just dependent on your mom or your dad, but if your dad is out hunting, you've got lots of other adults
Support
around.
systems.
Yeah, you're not stressed the way we are today, where and as there's greater and greater degrees of economic strain on families, then there's more and more. I could go into a whole tangent on economics, but I
Right.
heard an economist that I respect very much, Dr. Michael Hudson, say, when everyone came back from World War II, if you told those young men and women who had just gone through that ordeal, hey, the war is over, everyone's really happy, and just wait, in 2 generations, in order to have the same standard of living, your household's going to have to work 3 jobs.
And you'll
One of
still
you's going
live
to have to be
paycheck to
working.
paycheck.
You'll still live paycheck to paycheck, and you'll be wondering about, how to put food on the table. Their jaws would have hit the floor. They would have said, "Are you kidding me? How can that be?" And so we've created a society where it's harder and harder to um, provide, and so there's more and more anxiety, and children are more and more separated from their parents, even when they're young, and when they're very young, when they need that connection the most. And so we're creating a society that induces more trauma. But the good news is, we could look back and say, boy, I wish I was born in the time of ancient Egypt or ancient Greece or whatever. But if they had this in their midst, then they must have needed it too, because it is definitely a central aspect of the myths. And then just one other quick thing. So Dr. Mate talks a lot about ego and higher self, or the egoic self and the higher self. And I love his work. It's very powerful. And the work of Dr. Richard Schwartz, which I also found quite recently, also amazing, because he talks about parts. So it's not just, oh, that was my egoic mind, and now I'm in higher self. We're actually, each of us have all these different parts. Like, oh, there's this part of me, and there's that part of me. There's this critical part of me. And that critical part of you is actually playing a valuable role. Being critical is valuable, but it can get out of control, and it can get really hyper polarized, and it can take over, and you go, wow, what came over me? Or you can say to your wife or your significant other, oh, that wasn't me. And then she says, oh, yes, it was. That was you.
Yeah.
That was a part of you. I've seen that part before, and I don't like it. But there are all these parts. It's more than just an ego and a higher self. There's all these different parts, and everybody has a different set, a different, personality, with all different parts that are supposed to be playing a role, but the one that's supposed to be actually orchestrating them all. I like to use a metaphor of like a basketball coach who's got all these talented players. The coach is supposed to be orchestrating and using the strengths. Okay, well, you've got great defense. I want you in right now at this particular time. The coach knows how to keep all the players living up to their full potential and winning the game. But if they lock the coach in the basement because they don't trust the coach anymore, and they suppress the coach and they say, you let me down, I'm going to suppress you and make sure you never come back. Then all these talented players will all be trying to play the role of the coach, but they're not really, that's not their role. They shouldn't be doing that. They should be a forward or a center or a guard, but instead they're all arguing over what should be done. They yearn for a great coach to come along, but in the absence of a coach, they're all fighting with each other, and that's going to be a dysfunctional team. And that's what I think is an even better metaphor than just an ego. It's like we've got not just the 5 players on the court, but the 13 players on the bench, and we've locked a few players in the locker room as well because we're ashamed of them, or there's some hurt that they're carrying. And that's what's going on inside of us. And the self is actually capable of putting that all and fixing it all and leading them, but they've all locked the self in the basement. And so
Well, yeah, I think because they're fragmented. We become fragmented selves, and then those selves take on all of these ways to cope with the fragmentation. And, that's the thing that's really difficult, I think, to tell people that have experienced really deep trauma, is that they're the key to healing themselves. And it's like, if you hate yourself and you don't trust yourself, what steps do it's very difficult. And I mean, I lived it. It's hard to take those steps to even have a little bit of faith to start the journey of healing yourself. And, I think, though, for everybody it's different. I think people all came here for different reasons, and I'm not saying that I know what it is for people, but I think the ego plays a part in keeping that team, like you're saying, separated and feeds off of it. And I think that I think of my mom when I was younger, and this still just, I was always like, oh, is if something bad happened, or if I had, my brain wouldn't leave me alone when I was younger. I experienced a great deal of trauma, and she would tell me it was the devil that was messing with my head, and I just thought it more scientifically back then and thought it was my ego, just messing with me, because it's almost just like this doubt and fear and judgment. And it's really these low vibrational frequencies that once you resonate on those, then you're resonating on this frequency, and everything in your life is going to match that. And so it's really hard. I think I understand why people stay in trauma, and I understand why it's so difficult, because I think people are really terrified of themselves. Like you said, it's like they have this team that's like freaking out, and they don't know how to control it, and they don't have trust with themselves. And so, what do you say to somebody that's not ready, right? I guess you just wait until they are. I mean, it's hard to watch somebody hit rock bottom. And I was always fascinated, even as a kid, especially with what I went through, is why some people go through such traumatic experiences and don't go to those depths. Or if they do, they pull themselves out. They don't become violent. They don't become offenders. They don't become, and I'm just wondering, like like in the stars, what does it say really about the ego? Like, do you think that Venus or Saturn, a lot of people talk about
Right.
on conspiracies about like Saturn being, the basically Saturn worshipers, and they're kind of controlling this realm and keeping it dark and creating entities more and more to feed off of it, and I just wonder astrologically, like, what is your take on all of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, you mentioned like the Saturn cult conspiracy theory. I
Hmm.
think I've, listened to a lot of podcasts and been on a lot of podcasts going back to like 2011, 2012. And so, of course, I've heard a lot of that. And I think there's actually a lot of, I would say, mythology, except, I think of mythology as a very positive word, but we also use it in kind of a negative way. There's like there's conspiracy like truisms or mythologies that people just take
Right.
for granted. Like, well, the central banks are created by the Saturn worshipers, and they're the ones who invented money, and blah blah blah. And actually, a lot of the things that they say around those arguments are just wrong. They're just plain wrong.
Yeah.
Um, Saturn certainly is the figure who devours his own children in ancient myth, and is certainly associated with time and measurement, and time devours his or her own children, right? I mean, we're all within time, and eventually time will devour us. It's already slowly devouring us every day, right?
Yeah.
So, but I disagree with some of kind of the storyline or the mythology that is kind of just accepted without question in a lot of conspiracy circles. And
Because it's a
so,
great story. It's
yeah,
like a fun mythology. It's like modern mythology in a lot of ways, right?
yeah. I mean, we could talk about the creation of money and what were the Babylonians up to with their money and money system and the Roman money system, and how is it different? And debt. So debt is debt an important aspect of society? Can it traumatize you? Can it? But is credit necessary? I mean, credit is a necessary function in every society. You can't really start businesses without some access to credit. You can't.
Hmm.
If I wanted to start a shipping company and make huge ships that are going to go across the ocean between San Francisco and Alaska and China and Russia, I'm not going to build those ships, these multi-hundred-million-dollar ships just on my own savings. I'm going to have access to credit. So where does that come from? That whole question, um, there's like a whole storyline that, oh yeah, debt is automatically bad, and it was created by the Babylonians in order to enslave people. Actually, the Babylonians, if I mentioned Michael Hudson, I don't want to get off on a big long economic discussion, but the Babylonians had a function for the cancellation of debt, and he talks about it a lot in terms of this COVID lockdown.
Hmm.
There's actually in the ancient, the Hammurabi's code, there's a declaration that when the god of plagues visits the land with plagues, then all the debts shall be canceled. And those debts were canceled by the king. And this was Babylonia. This is ancient Mesopotamia. This is the people who are supposedly the ones who enslaved the world. Actually, they were canceling debts periodically. They were saying, oh, it's an act of God or an act of the gods, and so we've decided to cancel everybody's debt because of this act of the gods. We don't do that anymore. Now we're like, whoa, that's an interesting idea. How come I've never heard of that? Well, that's the conspiracy. It wasn't
Right.
the ancient wisdom was actually good. That's what I argue in Myth and Trauma, because there's a whole storyline that the ancient wisdom is just here to enslave us. The Bible is just here to enslave you, or the Anunnaki came down to enslave people to mine gold for them.
That feed off.
Now,
yeah.
Am I saying that everything is roses and unicorns and rainbows? No. Ponies? No. It's called Myth and Trauma because there are people who are deliberately inflicting trauma. And if you don't see that, if you didn't see that 2 years ago, maybe you could be excused for not seeing it. But if you don't see it today, that there's deliberate inflicting of trauma on people, then you're just not, you're lying to yourself. You probably,
Right.
there's a defensive part of you that doesn't want to see that because it's very threatening.
You've got some crazy glasses on.
But it's very threatening to think, to say, 9/11 could not have happened without the Pentagon switching off air defense measures that we have. We've got jets that can scramble. Believe me, the Pentagon's got air defense weapons around its perimeter. It can shoot down things that are coming at it. I was in the military. I wasn't at the Pentagon. I don't know firsthand, but I guarantee you that could not have happened without it being allowed to happen. And so that's a very threatening thing. That's something people recoil from. Like, well, that means I'm living in a world of a very threatening world.
Very threatening world. And then the people that are supposed to be keeping you safe, that you're kind of relying on to keep things in control, are totally, pulling all the strings in a really nefarious way, but maybe not the way that these, it's like when you get into Saturn worship, I'm not knowledgeable enough to say that none of that stuff exists or that people don't try to open up or deal with entities that are dark entities. But I think those demons are inside of them. I think that we hold all that, even the stories of the devil and the demons and the fallen angels. And, I think that is all within us to become those things and then to act them out on this planet. I think that, but I do think that you're right. I think that this is a traumatizing world, but it's also a learning realm. And I think that maybe, those, like, I don't know if governments and world issues are happening on a macro level instead of a micro level, which is happening inside of yourself. Because what people, they lie to themselves, they get jealous, they do all the nefarious things to themselves and to other people. Not all people, but on some spectrum, they do exactly what governments do to the world. We're all just in judgment of what's wrong, and then we'll turn around and do something not on the up and up. It's just we're all in judgment. So I don't know what your take on that.
No. And I don't deny, actually. So just to close the loop on banking, I mean, this is a long, but banking actually used to be controlled by the gods, or the representatives of the gods. The king was supposed to be acting to prevent the good gifts of the gods from being monopolized by a few oligarchs. And so that's why debt could be canceled by the king. And so private banking, as in corporations, they have to actually get a charter from the government to be a bank, because they're basically an arm of the government. They're able to create money, and they are able to create money out of thin air. But they've been given that power. It's like if I gave you the power over the electric grid or over the water supply, and then you started using that power that I gave you to say to people, hey, you know, your water bill last month, it was $25. This month it's going to be $250. And they say, what? And you say, well, I've got the charter from the government to be in charge of your water,
Right,
and
I can do whatever I want.
I can do whatever I want. And
Yeah.
eventually, and that's what's gone on with the money system. So the money system has been, people are right to zero in on that, but it's not, the Babylonians they weren't the originators of this problem. They actually understood you can cancel the debts in order to prevent oligopoly, in order to prevent, a few giant multi-billionaires from controlling the water supply, the electric supply. They didn't have an electric supply as far as we know, but the money supply, those things, and I didn't really intend to talk about this. It's easier to show it, but if I gave you the power of water over the water supply, that basically gives you a private tax. Now I'm paying Lindsay for my water instead of paying, the municipal water works, and it's going to Lindsay. Lindsay can buy whatever she wants from the money that everybody.
Well, then I start to use all my special interest groups of what I want from having water, and then that power gets corrupted because I withhold to get what I want or use against other people, which is happening all the time.
Right. And so that that whole dynamic. So I didn't. It's like this is like a 2-hour discussion, and I don't really want to get too sidetracked into it. But that whole like kind of conspiracy narrative, I think actually misses the real culprits, the real problem. The real problem is actually the privatization of banking and credit. So setting that aside.
But still, I mean, people are still using these conspiracies as like ancient myths that are being tapped into today to still control the world, regardless if it's banking or not, even if it's feeding off of our energy or harming our children, or, and like when you were talking about it, I'm just wondering how that astrologically fits into even the myths that we have today, as far as like this, just, I guess, myths about like the demons that we have inside of ourselves and how we set ourselves free. I mean, I heard you talk about, the equinoxes are very representative, just like, Jesus dying on the cross and then Jesus rising, and that, which I think is really awesome. It makes a lot of sense to me, especially how it's in so many cultures. And, astrologically, you were saying that the stars don't even line up when you really go back and study like what they're talking about, which direction, that, these things, that it was more symbolic. And I just wonder, like, the trauma that's happening, that is probably has been repeated throughout history. Like, what is the astrological alignment of all of this trauma?
Yeah. So let me try and close the door on what I was saying too, to loop it into this conversation, because what I believe happened was there was ancient wisdom that was given to every culture on earth. And then there was a group that came in and deliberately overthrew the ancient wisdom. And they did that in the time of the Roman Empire. And they did that to deliberately get rid of the old gods. I mean, there were Roman gods, right? There was Jupiter, there was Venus, there was Mercury. Those were the gods of Rome. And then it was supplanted by literalist Christianity, which came in and said, we have the truth and everything else is lies and, created by demons. Everything else is the lies of demons and devils. When actually they were using a system, the Bible, the stories in the Bible are very ancient stories, including the New Testament. I call it the so-called New Testament. It probably should be called the really, really Old Testament. But they came in and took these stories and said, title. These are true, and all those gods are false. And so get rid of those gods and everything they say and go with this new system. We're going to introduce new calendars. We're going to introduce new weights and measures, and we're going to actually introduce a new oligarchy. And now these people are God's chosen rulers, and They're the ones who get to own the land, and everyone else gets to be a serf, a peasant. And they understood the system that they were overthrowing. It's very clear that they understood the system, but it's like, I use a metaphor of a kung fu master. A kung fu master is supposed to be protecting the weak, stopping bullies and
right, the
protecting
villagers and.
But if you were let's say you were really good at kung fu and you decided to use it to oppress people or beat people up or take over the town, that's what happened. So the people who understood this ancient system, and I'll get to your question about demons and used it, the system is like a very powerful kung fu system, and you can use it to overcome trauma, but you could also use it to inflict trauma. And that's what has happened. And it has gone around the world finding people who still remembered their ancient wisdom and stamping out their ancient wisdom. When the descendants of the Roman Empire came over to the Americas, they immediately started burning the texts of the Maya and immediately started killing, the kings and the leaders. And they did the same thing. They said, okay, you have to speak English now, or you have to speak Spanish, and you have to put away the drums. You can't use kill the shamans. That is a deliberate overthrowing of the ancient wisdom, and has been used in order to it is using a gift that's supposed to benefit humanity instead to oppress humanity. That's the real conspiracy. It's not, and I think that's sensed and understood when I'm not belittling people who are trying to figure out what's going on and saying, oh yeah, that story about the Saturn cult makes sense to me. They're trying to figure out what's going on. I would argue that this is the story of what happened, and it imposed basically feudalism on Europe, Western Europe, the Western Roman Empire, and then that turned into the European cultures that basically went around colonizing, and oppressing Africa and South America and other parts of the world, and imposing this system everywhere. And that system is based around coughing up to basically oligarchs what actually belongs to all the people and was given by the gods. The gods gave water. There's a goddess of water. There's a god of the ocean. There's all these gifts. There's a goddess of the land that gives the grain. All these gifts are given by the gods, and yet certain people have said, oh no, forget about those gods. You need to cough up everything that grows on the land to the landlord, and it belongs to him, not to you. That's what. Is there some background noise? Do you hear?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I turned my heater off.
Oh no! Don't do that.
It's okay.
You're in Alaska.
I'll get a blanket or something. I'm in Alaska and I live in a tin can. I live in an RV, so. But it's okay. I'd rather listen to this.
No, turn it back on. But so when it's like what I said about the 9/11, the September 11th. Some people will resist that very strongly if you tell them, it could not have been done without some switches being turned off that would normally defend against, air attacks.
Right.
That's
so do you think that those are also like the trauma that we're all being subjected to? Do you feel like they're also still looking to the stars and dropping this information on us, like lining up specifically with events astrologically to tap into that power?
So I don't have any inside knowledge. I'm never been part of any of those groups, but there does seem to be evidence that it's the same. There's a continuity. There's a knowledge of the system. The kung fu has been handed down. That's not so hard to believe that, kung fu gets handed down from generation to generation, and people might make changes to it, but it seems like they're still practicing the same system, but using it to oppress and fragment instead of using it to heal and uplift. So now to tie it into this question of, well, what happens, all these demons inside of me. I am not a psychologist, I'm not a practicing psychologist, but when you read and listen to people like Dr. Richard Schwartz or Dr. Gabor Mate, sorry, they say, look, when you're a little 1 or 2 year old, you are completely dependent upon your parents. You cannot survive independently. A 1 or a 2 year old cannot live in Alaska independently, needs its parents. So if your father is periodically alcoholic and throws unpredictable rages, you're dependent upon your father and your mother completely. So if you see, my father is often great, but every now and then, and I never can predict when it's going to happen, he explodes and starts doing totally threatening things. Because you're so dependent on your parents, you will say, it's very threatening to say, there's something wrong with my dad. My dad is broken. So it's the same thing as saying, do you know that 9/11 could not have happened without some complicity? Well, right. That's very threatening. I don't want to believe that. I don't want to believe that the social contract is broken and the government that's, supposed to be protecting people is actually allowing things like that to happen, or allowing Epstein to roam around, right? That guy was allowed to roam around and do what he did.
He had an office at Harvard. Yeah. After he was convicted.
So the people who are supposed to be protecting little girls from that kind of predatory behavior were actually enabling that. That's very threatening. And so that's on the political level. On the family level, it's the same thing. The child will say, not there's something wrong with dad, but there's something wrong with me. It's actually less threatening to believe there's something wrong with me, and if I work hard, I can fix it. That's actually less threatening to our psyche than there's something wrong with dad, and I have no control over it, and he goes crazy unpredictably, and I can't do anything about it. It's actually, what we do is we internalize the problem, and we say, there must be something wrong with me. What can I do? And so the voice of the critical parent gets internalized and starts yelling, and so 30, 40 years later, it's still yelling at you in your head, why can't you do anything right? And you've internalized that voice. And so and you've separated from yourself. That's how you separate from yourself. And so those voices can become very polarized. And so the word devil means an enemy. The word Satan means the adversary, the accuser. Mm-hmm. Those beings in the stories, whether they're also external, we can just set that aside. I think there's plenty of evidence that there's this pattern repeats internally and also externally. Right. But that voice, that critical accuser, is within you. And it can become very dangerous.
That's what I'm saying. It's like if you're resonating on that frequency, regardless whether you're aware of it consciously or subconsciously, you're going to attract that if the realms, if there are other realms feeding off of that frequency. And it opens up. That's why I think that a lot of children that experience a lot of deep trauma also have a lot of paranormal experiences and are able to see, I'll speak from experience, just able to see things. I've had a lot of paranormal experiences, whether or not, people could look and look at me and know my background and think that came from, growing up with my dad, who was a theologian, but also very volatile in a lot of ways and, mixed with a lot of trauma. And then also the religion, we were Pentecostal. So I actually saw a woman in a church when I was very young get depossessed in front of me. and was yelled at actually when I went up towards to see what was going on. And psychologically, that's going to traumatize a child, especially if there's no one around to have this safety. There's no comfort, there's no explanation. And so your brain, like you said, it's like you're trying to come up with control of how to make sense of these things that you're exposed to, especially if you have no parent to do that. And so I understand like internalizing and those demons. It's like that's what they say even when people are dealing with drugs. It's like you got to combat your demons and you got to look at your demons. And when we're healing, we have to look at our demons. And that's symbolic, but it could also be a physical thing that's going on with people. I don't know the answer to that. Even with the experiences that I had, I would say, a couple years ago, I would have said that those were entities that were outside that were preying upon me. And I don't know how I feel about it today. I feel like those are within all of us. And depending on, but I also think that there has to be darkness because you can also project light and tap into the light and be with your divine and to be with your high self and angelic beings and God and Godhead and on and on and on. There's all these levels of consciousness. So there has to be that false sense of duality too, right? The illusion. It's the absence of light has to exist, which is kind of, what I was really into is like the Vesica Pisca, it's like it makes sense on a quantum level why we would all have such similar experiences and be able to feel each other's emotions. And, quantum healing, when I go back and heal my childhood, I'm going back in time, but I'm also going into the future. And my relationships with people that maybe I was resonating on a certain frequency with were healed. And so those emotions don't come up anymore. And I mean, to me, I think that is magical, but I also think it's attainable. Like, I don't think it's woo-woo magical. I think that's what we have inside of us. And I think, it's fascinating to me because I feel like what happens in this realm is what we do to ourselves. But do we do it to ourselves because we need those things to trigger our healing response inside of us? Like, that's kind of what I play around with. It's like, do we need to experience this trauma? Did we agree to come here to experience this trauma so we could understand how powerful we were? And did these people that are in this role, say government or banks, do they voluntarily take on these roles to stimulate that which the world needs to be able to see the illusion in the first place? I don't know.
Yeah. So you said a lot of that's a really good discussion. And if I could dial back from the second part is, the question of did we make this agreement when we came here?
Right.
Let me just set that aside.
Sorry,
I don't. No. I mean, I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
I've heard that, of course. I don't know. That. Let me go to the earlier interesting question that you were talking about. Is that are these demons inside or outside or both?
Right.
And then you also mentioned the word woo-woo, which is like that's the the term that's thrown around mostly by people. So I would say this question is not just about the demons, but also about the gods. One of my favorite ancient epics is the Odyssey, and the companion to the Iliad. And every now and then, the gods will speak to someone. Like Odysseus will get a visit from Athena or from Hermes. So is that just inside of your head, or is it external? I would say that question actually is not that important.
Right.
I would argue it doesn't matter.
Right.
It matters the most to the people who want to deny the possibility that it could possibly be external.
Right.
The people who use the term woo-woo are the people who are hardcore materialist.
Which is the new religion, by the way.
It is a new religion, right? Well, so that's an interesting tangent we could go off on too, right?
Yeah.
If you're controlling everybody through literalism and they're all believing literalist, basically the Bible, and then people start to fall away from that, you better put something else in order to control them.
Right.
And what you put in is another thing that will not lead them to overcoming trauma.
Exactly. Yes. Well, and because it's all this with outside of yourself, it's not looking within.
Right. That's exactly right. And so the question of whether the gods are external or internal is mostly, I would argue, interesting to people who want to deny that it could possibly be external.
Mm-hmm.
So I wrote about this. There's a very interesting teacher named Paul Selig. I don't know if you've heard of Paul Selig, and he hears the guides speak to him, and he's clairaudient, and he'll start to hear and repeat it very, very fast, what he's hearing, and then he'll slow down and say what they just said. And I've heard him do that. And the question is, where's that coming from? Is it coming from within his own head? Or is it coming from outside?
Channeling. Yeah, it's channeling higher consciousness.
It's channeling. And so is that his subconscious speaking and then his conscious is able to hear it and speak it? Or is it from outside of him? I don't really care. I don't think it's any less wonderful or mysterious if it's the subconscious is amazing already, right?
Right.
Your subconscious can know things that actually shouldn't be able to know, like what's happening to one of your friends in another state far away, and you call them up and they say, "Oh, I was just, thinking of calling you or something." Well, how did that happen?
Well, we come from the whole. I think that's absolutely why. Because the duality is an illusion, and then it's creating within the center of it. That's the creation. That's the many, but we're all the many.
And so if his subconscious is tapped into somehow, the realm of the gods, is it any less amazing to say, well, he's able to hear his subconscious and tell you what it's saying? Now, some people would say, oh, your subconscious, that's all psychological. Yeah. Oh, those demons are all psychological. They just want us, they don't. And
well, they're spiritual deniers that we are not, I think they separate themselves from the idea even that we are the divine, that we are God. I mean, I think when they need absolute logical answers, and it's known, your logical brain, when it's trying to make sense of things, is inaccurate most of the time because it's trying to come up with logical answers that are unexplainable. And I think that's kind of the funny part of it. I've never really gotten too hung up on people like that because I think it's kind of funny and sad in a little way that they can't understand that the world really is a magical place. And I don't mean that to discredit all of the research that's gone on, but the world, when you are tapped in, is a magical place. And it's both. It's coming from within and without. It's that's outside right. of you, but you're downloading it, you're channeling it, you're connecting.
That's
you can
right.
put your consciousness into other realms. You can bring that into yourself. And, that's what I'm saying is we're bringing the spirit realm and communicating with the spirit realm and bringing it into this physical world.
So if a musician says, I don't know where that song came from, it's just like I felt inspired. Does it matter? That if the ancient myths say the gods came and inspired Odysseus not to walk into that trap and helped him not walk in, was that it came from, like you said, it's outside of the small egoic mind. Somehow your subconscious mind is tapped into, or your higher self is tapped into something bigger. Mm-hmm. And so, whether it exists external, I think it does. I think there's evidence that there is external, that the things that are going on inside of us are also mirrored on, a different plane as well. Yeah. But even if you want to just set that aside and say, oh no, that's too weird for me, it's still there's still very powerful. How do I get tapped into my inspiration that I have access to? Right. Where it comes from almost doesn't matter. But the myths are pointing towards how you get in touch with that self that is indestructible and can help you live up to your full potential. And it's like, to me, a metaphor that I just thought of today. I haven't used this metaphor before, but I was reading this book by Dr. Stephen Lin, whom I've met. He's a dentist from Australia, and he and I were speaking at a conference last year in 2019. Seems like so long ago now. And he talks about how every single diet in the world, what I mean is way of eating, not diet in the modern sense. Every single culture was their diets, wherever they were, whether they were in Alaska, where there's a very different, access to vitamins than, let's say, in the middle of India or in the middle of Africa. No
Right.
matter where they were, they made sure to get vitamins A, D, and K, especially K2. And if you don't get those things, your health is going to suffer. Like within one generation, there's actually going to be major problems that will happen. And this has happened when indigenous cultures have gone from their traditional way of eating to the Western diet. Just
Yeah, they all have
destroys health
diabetes.
immediately. It
Yeah.
destroys health immediately.
Yeah.
And I was reading and I was thinking, this is a very powerful metaphor for the same. We were all given this ancient wisdom that is, every culture was given it, and then something came in and basically said, stop eating those, organ meats. You don't want to eat liver. That's bad for you, and it's like they took away the ancient wisdom, and our spiritual health will decline within a generation. It's like the ancient wisdom is there for a positive. It's got these very powerful positive benefits, and it has been deliberately taken away and replaced with basically junk food that
Right.
doesn't actually nourish and leads to all kinds of traumas and dysfunctions. So I forget
It's true. I
what
think
made
that
me think of
anything that
that
is
from what you were
good,
saying.
anything that's good and natural and organic and comes from within, I think people see how powerful we are. People, I don't, whomever, and take that, change it, cheapen it, and then sell it back to us at a higher price that stimulates nothing but the ego. And it really is empty calories, that is just, it's like the world has like spiritual diabetes in a lot of ways. People are robbed of this nurture that they have inside of them. I know that most people right now that can connect to anywhere in the world and travel anywhere in the world, uh, like loneliness is one of the number one things that people are suffering from. And it's because, like you say, the disconnection from themselves. They don't have that spiritual connection with themselves. They are fragmented, they're traumatized, and they're looking for outside sources to heal their trauma. And I'm not saying you can't have help, but if you're looking for people that are traumatizing you, with food to help you, with alcohol to help you, with drugs to help you, with the news to help you, with your government to help you, with, people that want to take advantage, it's like we hold that power within inside of ourselves, and that is free. It really is, and we can all do it. And, my goal is to really tap in and to bring as much light to this planet as possible at all times. Because I feel like our high selves, when you're tapped into your high self, regardless if somebody's not, I think that your high self can communicate with people. And I think on a soul level, it's like we're a lot more porous than we think we are. We are emotional beings having an emotional experience. And when you're around somebody, I think, who has a high frequency or has healed their trauma, and not like healed forever, like in an arrogant way, like your lessons are done, but in an authentic way, I think that something within inside people, it resonates on that because we're so interconnected. And I think that that healing power is so powerful. So, I mean, that's really what I think, hopefully is happening now, but it's become so polarized. I feel like people are either going to make the decision or be forced to wake up and to realize that they're the key to their own jail cell, or they're going to decline. And unfortunately, a lot of people have, it's like with 2020, what's gone on, I think a lot of relapse has gone on, and a lot of suicides have gone on, and a lot of violence, and, people feeling really fragmented and disconnected. And that's why I wanted to talk to you so much. And I can't wait. I ordered your book. I can't wait for it to get here
Thank you.
because I really do think that it's trauma that keeps us fragmented from healing ourselves. And those demons tell us that we can't do it, that we're not good enough, and we're on the lowest vibrations. They just resonate on the lowest vibrations that just feel like you're trapped in hell, you know, and it's in all of these stories that you say, in all the myths and
Yeah.
in all of the biblical stories of going down to the depths to rescue yourself, you know. And even if it's there was a story that you were talking about where the man has to go and get his girlfriend or his wife from hell,
Yeah.
and he looks back
Eurydice.
at
Yeah.
her.
It's Orpheus and Eurydice. And
Yeah, I
that's
mean,
and that's doubt, right? That why
doubt,
does he look back?
exactly.
Because of doubt. And there's so and you know, you've mentioned doubt as being a low, you know, a low vibration. There is so much doubt um, pattern in the myths. You know, in the Bible, who's the figure who's most associated with doubt? Would you that you can think of? Anyone have
That's
doubt in their
doubt.
name? Yeah, doubting, a doubter. Doubting Thomas is who I'm thinking of.
Oh yeah,
Doubting
okay.
Thomas, right? So that's a very powerful story of why does Thomas doubt? But there's also in this, the Bhagavad Gita is about basically the doubt of Arjun. It's not, um, he's got everything he needs, but he's still filled with doubt and self-division. He's kind of two minds. He doesn't know which way to go. Should I do this? Should I do that? He's full of doubt, even though he's got everything that he needs.
Right, he's
There's
blind to it.
doubting is, you know, the Orpheus story, what you're talking about, we call it the Orpheus and Eurydice story because of the ancient Greek myth, but actually all the Native American tribes from the West Coast all the way across to the East Coast have a version of that same myth pattern, and actually most of them seem to have preserved even more of the details of it than are preserved in ancient Greece, which is very interesting. Um, so when some of the first missionaries, you know, colonizing uh, Europeans from the 1500s came over, they said, "What's going on? There's this Orpheus and Eurydice story here in the Americas." And the story is Orpheus is the greatest harp player of all. He's the greatest musician. He can play his instrument so beautifully that even the rocks will start to weep. If he wants to play, you know, a sad song, he can make the rocks start to weep. And he has a beautiful bride, Eurydice. She loves him so much, and on the very day of their marriage, she's walking through the field, getting ready to go to the wedding, or maybe it's just right after the wedding, and steps on a snake, and it bites her heel or her ankle, and it's a poisonous snake, and she dies within minutes. And Orpheus is just heartbroken, and he can't live without her, so he says, "I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to go down to the underworld, and I'm going to beg for mercy from the god and the goddess of the underworld, and say, look, this is not, you know, this is not something you have to do, but would you please, please, please let Eurydice come back with me, and I'll play my harp and try and melt your hearts and get you on my side, get you to say yes." And they say, "Okay, you know, Orpheus, your love is amazing, your music is amazing. I'm gonna let Eurydice go back with you, but you have to go first, and she's gonna walk behind you, and all the way back up to the to the land of the living. You cannot look back. If you look back, then you doubted us. You didn't give us enough trust. You thought we might be untrue to our word, and we won't let her go." And so he's walking, and he doesn't hear anyone behind him because she's still a ghost, but she's following him, but he doesn't want to look back. It's torture, you know, all the way back up. And then finally at the very end, you know, he makes himself not look back. And the very end is kind of a step to get back up to the green grass of the earth, you know, that last little lip. And so he turns around instinctively to help Eurydice, not thinking, and sees her just vanish back into the underworld because he looked. He shouldn't have looked. But that story is in the Native American traditions. They have the same pattern of a husband who has to go back and rescue his bride um, from the underworld. And sometimes he has to cross a river where there's an eagle who will swoop down and try and scare him. And he has to cross on a bridge that's as thin as a rope. And if the eagle causes him to fall into the water, he'll turn into a salmon. And then when he gets to the other side, he's in the realm of the dead and he sees them dancing in a circular pattern. None of this is in the Orpheus story, but it's all celestial. I can show, I prepared a little slideshow if you want to see it or if we have time, but it's all celestial. I didn't put slides of this one, but I talk about it in one of my books. And they have different patterns. In some patterns, in some of the cultures, he's not allowed to embrace his wife. When she gets back, he has to, they have to sleep in the same tent. But if he hugs her for the first week, it's all over. She'll go back to the underworld. And of course, kind of in his sleep, he embraces his wife, and then he wakes up and it's a rotting log instead of his wife there because she's had to go back to the underworld.
Well, and to me, like you were saying, that it's that he doesn't have trust within the underworld. I feel like it's that he doesn't have trust with himself, because he's panicking all the time, like, and it's that disruption of not trusting ourselves, even when everything is totally given to us, when we're the best at something, or we have our gifts and we're, but we're worried and displacing our trust in other things. And or go ahead. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, or even distrusting others that we know better for them, like having to help his ghost wife over that step, not trusting that she could do it herself. Right. And I think that a lot of times that's us in judgment, thinking that we know better for somebody else, and we don't. That's really the truth of it. We don't know better for somebody else, no matter where they're at in their lives.
And I wanted to mention that because in preparation, I listened to your I listened to the one podcast where you're talking about your therapist that didn't want to let you, get better.
Oh yeah. Yes.
And the thing I like about IFS, what I've read about it is you have to let the person, the client, the man or the woman has a self. That self is the one that can do the work, not you. So, but there's this tendency to not want to let go, right? Or not want to manipulate. And the other part of it, I think, in those stories is he's on autopilot in both. He turns around without thinking. He hugs his wife without thinking. He's not
being mindful.
Well, it's like our parts or our egoic self, we have this phrase called push someone's buttons, and some people really know how to push your buttons. It's like
children.
Kids know how to push their parents' buttons pretty well. What does that mean when someone's pushing your buttons? It's like they're manipulating you like you're a robot. They're like,
right.
Oh, let me see if I can. Let me say something that'll really make you mad.
Anger you.
Yeah, right.
Make you feel bad about yourself.
And make you respond almost without whether you. What are they doing? They're playing on your. You've got these part. You're not in self, obviously. When someone's pushing your buttons, you've got some defensive part of you that is protecting something. Protecting some shame or some guilt or some fear that you have, maybe from when you were very little. But every time that gets triggered, you go into this mode. You're not yourself, right?
Yeah.
When you're hungry. It's like the "you're not yourself when you're hungry" commercial. The Snickers commercial is actually a funny commercial. It's like something takes over you. Well, what took over you? It's like an algorithm from your past, from when you were 2. It's like some old code that's still in there that's being triggered.
Yeah.
And it's not, it's actually, it was written for a positive purpose. It was written to protect you in some way.
Right? It's an indicator.
Yeah, it's like a mechanism in a car or something, but it's obsolete. It's like you're not 2 anymore, but it's still kicking in. It's a helpful, it's trying to be helpful. It's like a helpful, it's like in the story of the Lord of the Rings, the Golem character has this, very controlling, very very defensive, Golem part, right? That's
he's like coveting the ring so much that it's making him insane.
And when Smeagol tries to say, "Hey, I don't need you anymore, go away," that part, that Golem part says, "I'm the one who got us through this. I saved us. It was me. I'm the one who protects us." I get us through this. It's actually trying to do something positive. It's actually a positive intention. I'm going to keep us from crashing this car. I'm going to keep us from
No, I
crashing.
totally understand that. I
But
think
it's out of control.
always on our side, regardless of where we're at. We are always on our side. Even when we're driving to go get our fix, we're still on our side, you know.
But it can be doing something harmful,
Very harmful,
thinking that
yes.
it's thinking, but it's trying to protect against something that it thinks is even more harmful. And until you
Exactly.
address that. So anyway, that's I mean,
Doing the
hopefully,
best you can.
yeah. So I don't know. Hopefully that gets into some of the areas that you wanted to talk about. I can show some of the
I would
but
love to see some of the slides. Yeah, and I'm just gonna let you talk while you show them. I need to hit the share screen button. Is that correct?
I don't think so. I think I have to
Did you
share
do
screen.
it?
Yeah, I can do. I think I can do
Oh,
it. Let me
that's
see here.
great. That's even
Let me
better.
just try. So
This stuff is, it's so fascinating to me. I can really talk about this for a long time just because it's very interesting. I could
I
see
should
me.
be sharing my screen. So can you see that?
You know, that's the story that we're told and the language that we use. Even, just people are constantly belittling themselves
Mm.
for a way to connect with each other. And I think it's really underestimated how much our language is creating our reality. And so I like both of those stories. I think that I just like the idea of just being kind of like a passionate Baptist, you know?
Thanks. Well, that thanks for sharing why those. I'm glad I asked why you chose those because those are great choices and those are great reasons. And so what I've hinted at as we've been talking is that I would argue that the stories, and I shouldn't be sharing now. You should just see me, right? Did I stop sharing?
Yeah. You stop sharing. I just see you.
Okay, good. Yeah. Because I wanted to let you explain and not just have a picture up while you were doing that.
Yeah.
But these stories in the ancient myths are very powerful and very profound, but they're not literal. I can show that they're not literal. But some people, who may be watching, I don't want to I don't want to harm someone's beliefs. I don't think the general people are the problem. I think it's certain people at the top
Fundamental, yeah.
who are doing things. Um, so if you don't want to see evidence that these stories are actually based on the stars, then you should not
Look
watch this
away.
part. Yeah, look away.
It's your
Right.
time to get off of the podcast.
Yeah. So let me share my screen. So we'll start with David and Goliath because that is old. It comes first in the Bible. It's in the so-called Old Testament. I think they're both very, very ancient. So you should see a picture of someone doing some activity. Can you see it now?
Like the women weaving.
Yes. So
Hmm.
the woman who's seated kind of with her back mostly towards us is weaving, and she's weaving at a what? What do we call that? We hardly ever see them anymore. So
I
it's
don't know
a
what it's called.
it's a device. It's a mechanism she's using. She's going to make a beautiful rug, and in fact, you can see it down below her left arm. You can
Hmm.
see it beginning to take shape. It's called a loom,
A
right?
loom, yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
It's kind of taller than it is
Yeah.
wide. It's got a bar across the top and another bar, kind of not quite halfway down. And it's got two vertical posts, and she's weaving across the vertical threads there. This is a very traditional and ancient, and it's found worldwide. This is a Navajo traditional weaving that's going on. She has in her right hand, I think that's called the batten. It looks like she's got a batten in her right hand, which is what she uses to kind of tamp down the threads. And in her left hand,
Right.
she's got the thread. She's going to weave that in between the vertical lines, which is called the warp. She's going to weave them in between them. She's making that um, blanket or piece of fabric down below. Here's another one, also from the American Southwest of North America.
Hmm.
Look at all the different colors she's got. Each color in the pattern, she needs a different thread. So when she gets to the part that's got to be black, then she picks up with the black and moves that through. But again, she's using a loom. You can see it goes all the way up to the rafters there. It's got a pretty large beam across the top. It's got another kind of stick with the ropes to keep the tension. And she's got a batten in her hand too, in her right hand.
Yeah.
So she's going to weave it through with her left hand, batten it down with her right hand, and she's making this beautiful thing from the bottom up. This is in Turkey. I found all this on just Wikipedia. These are public, you know.
That is
uh,
incredible. Look at all those balls of yarn
look at
just
yeah, look
yeah.
at the colors at the bottom. I mean,
I
she's using
know,
lots of
I
different
know. It's
colors.
amazing. It
And
really is like weaving the fabric of a story together.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's actually a metaphor that's used in myth around the world. And she's got a pretty big batten there in her left hand to
Yeah,
batten
that is
down.
huge.
But it actually goes down. You can see she's on kind of a pedestal with some cinder blocks
Hmm.
on that's holding up the piece of wood that she's sitting on because as she continues upwards, they're just going to keep raising the platform. So it goes down actually below. It goes down through a slot. She's got
Oh
more than
yeah,
just
it's
a
sort of
foot.
feeding.
Yeah, she's probably like got 4 feet of the rug made already, but she's going to keep going up and up. So this is a very ancient technology, and it is definitely talked about in ancient myth, the myth of weaving at the loom. And here's one more. I'm actually going to show two more. These are diagrams, but I show this because, again, it's a similar shape, kind of taller than it is wide. And this one has a triangular, they've got the tensioning rope at the top,
Hmm.
triangular. This one's actually a back strap loom. The strap at the bottom, you can actually put that around your waist, around your lower back, and pull the tension as you're weaving. But you see,
Wow.
it's labeling the batten. The
Crafts on the
batten
go.
is, yeah. So, but still, still used. Obviously, now we have mechanical looms and textiles and things. But here's one more, a little bit more
Oh yeah,
elaborate.
that one's huge, huh?
Look at that. And see, again, we've got this kind of oblong shape. It's kind of like, oblong, taller than it is wide, kind of like a tombstone or a gas pedal is taller than it is wide. And then at the top, there's kind of some triangular tensioners at the top. Why am I showing all this? Because now we're looking at the stars. So this is a screenshot that I've taken of a planetarium app called Stellarium that I use.
Yeah.
You see anything in there that might resemble a loom? If you had to guess out of the
Yeah, the
constellation,
Orpheus?
yes,
Yes,
that's Ophiuchus.
absolutely.
I say Ophiuchus. I don't know.
Oh,
It
Fucus.
could be Ophiuchus.
Oh,
Um,
yeah, don't
no,
take
no.
me for him.
I don't know. I don't speak ancient Greek. How did they originally say it? I don't know. But it comes from the word for a serpent. Ophites are people who worship serpents. Ophite is a Greek word for snake. So this is the serpent holder. You see how he's holding a serpent?
Yeah, yeah, right. Like
Now you mentioned that you have a Pentecostal background. I don't know if you've ever heard of serpent handling.
they're like a sidestep away from, I didn't experience that, but they're a sidestep from that. I
Because
experienced a lot of weird things though,
yeah,
people speaking in tongues and
I've been to a Pentecostal service in North Carolina, actually, when I was
Yeah.
just becoming a literalist Christian. But why is that part of the tradition? Because there's verses in the New Testament that say, they shall take up serpents and not be harmed. Now, those are celestial descriptions. All the things that are going on in the scriptures are celestial. That's why you have that verse in the Bible. They
Right.
can walk on serpents and not be harmed. Look at what Ophiuchus is walking on. Do you see?
Right. The Scorpio.
He's walking on a multi-headed serpent. I mean, Scorpio could be a scorpion, but actually shows up in myth more often as some kind of a serpent or a multi-headed serpent, like the Hydra that Hercules or Heracles fights. But
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. Ophiuchus could also be a loom, and it is indisputable that Ophiuchus sometimes is a loom that someone will weave at. So good job, Lindsay. You got the right answer. That
All
is,
right.
and who's weaving at the loom in some of the myths?
Oh, look at
It's
that.
Sagittarius. See how she's
Bent
Sagittarius?
over and she's
Yeah,
got the
she's
thing.
even
Yeah.
got like a shuttle there in her hand. But
Yeah.
all these different figures can play different characters in the myths. Like I said, Ophiuchus could be someone holding a serpent, but it could be a loom. It could also be a mountain. It could be a cave. It could be a lot of different things. Um,
It
and
looks like a
Sagittarius,
dancing crayon with wings.
yeah. So often it does have wings. So
Yeah.
that's a description. In Sagittarius, I said she's weaving at the loom, but Sagittarius will play male figures in myth. Sometimes it's a god, sometimes Sagittarius is a goddess, sometimes it's a beautiful young woman, sometimes it's a young
Is it
hero like
ever
a
with a bow? Because it looks like a
oh
bow and
yes,
arrow.
absolutely. And the word Sagittarius actually, the word Sagitta means arrow in Latin. So
Okay.
Sagittarius means the arrow launcher or the arrow shooter. So it is the archer.
Hmm.
But it could be a bow. It could be someone weaving at the loom. So
It looks like an offering too, doesn't it, to like one of
yes,
the to the gods?
very keen observation. So Sagittarius will often be a priestly figure who's pouring out oil. There's a
Oh,
different way of connecting the stars that could be pouring out an offering. Or it could even be, the bow could even be folded hands in some
uh-huh.
cases. Like when Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers, if you look at the artwork,
Yeah.
he's often portrayed as a Sagittarius figure with his arms crossed and bound at the wrists or something like that. So here's a
Yeah.
passage Odyssey. I'm just going to um, show you that here we have many times in the Odyssey, we have a goddess or a beautiful woman who is depicted as weaving at the loom. In this case, we have the goddess Calypso in who's holding Odysseus captive. When we first see her, she's on her island, and it says she's living in this grotto, a beautiful cave on this island in the middle of the ocean, far away from everyone else. And she's within the cave, singing with a beautiful voice and going over the web. That is, she's weaving on the loom. She's going
Hmm.
over the web, weaving with a golden shuttle. And even this is a translation from the 1800s, but it explains, she's weaving at the loom. When it says going over the web, it means moving backwards and forwards with the shuttle. She's putting the thread in between the ancients wove standing. And you can see in the picture here the stars. We've got Sagittarius weaving at the loom, and that's Calypso in this case. And there's many other places where Penelope, the wife of Odysseus, is always weaving at the loom, and then every night she undoes her work. How's that for a metaphor of self-destruction or self-sabotage? She's actually trying to prevent the suitors are all gathering around asking her to marry one of them. And she says, well, as soon as I finish what I'm weaving. And so every day she weaves all day, and every night she undoes what
Destroys it.
she destroys it. So that's another picture. We can fall into that pattern for sure. Um,
That's awesome. Yeah.
so why am I showing all this when you asked to talk about David and Goliath? Well, I'll get to
Yeah.
that. But here's a goddess from ancient Egypt.
Hmm.
It's down at the bottom. If you look very closely, and I often say if you're trying to look at this on an iPhone, or you might want to put it on a desktop so you can see the stars more clearly. But this is the goddess Neve or Neith, and it says this. This is another text from the 1800s where they're talking about her. A form of Isis wears sometimes a shuttle on her head, sometimes the crown of Lower Egypt. You see the crown of Lower Egypt that she's
Yeah.
wearing? Does it
Mm-hmm.
at all like the outline of Sagittarius, which she's wearing on her head?
Yeah.
That shuttle, so shuttles come in different shapes, but this is an actual piece of ancient Egyptian artwork. Obviously, it's a 1800s illustrator imitating what's carved into the stone, but that's a shuttle on her head because she's associated with that constellation, and that to me is more additional evidence, or I would say proof, that that feature of Sagittarius is sometimes envisioned as a shuttle weaving at the loom of Ophiuchus. Are you following my argument
Totally.
here?
Yeah. I get it. Yeah.
In fact, here's some other pictures of a traditional shuttle that I think look a little bit more. Sometimes a shuttle has the open ends. So you put the thread around the shuttle. In these shuttles that I've put up at the top, you put the thread around that middle spool, and then you weave that in between the warp on the loom.
Yeah. It's
So
like
why?
the eye of a needle, isn't it?
Yeah, and it looks like the thing that Sagittarius is holding could be envisioned as a shuttle
Mm-hmm.
with a spindle in the middle of it for weaving at the loom of Ophiuchus. Why, oh why, are we talking about this when you asked about David and Goliath? What does this have to do with David and Goliath? Well, I'll show you in a minute. Here's a
That.
painting from the 1800s. There's David getting ready to. Goliath is saying, "Won't anybody challenge me? Come on!" And then David is disgusted that no one else will be brave enough to go out there and says, "I'll do it." And then Goliath says, "What's going? Why are you sending out this kid? I don't that you're insulting me, you know." And then he says to David, "Come over here so I can kill you." And David says, "Not so fast." And he says, "Not by my own power, but by the power of the Almighty, I will triumph here if God allows me to do so." So this is a celestial story, and in fact, the actual outlines of these figures in artwork harkens back to specific constellations that we can look at. But let me just look at the text. This is from 1 Samuel. Here's where we find it. The staff of his spear, this is talking about Goliath, was like a what? Can you see it there?
Beam. Yeah.
Weaver's
Mm-hmm.
beam. Huh, what's that? What's that mean?
Weird.
Look at how we have the frame of the loom there, and look at how thick that thing is.
Yeah.
That would be
It looks like a shovel almost. Yeah.
yeah. Well, that's the batten that she battens down with. But the beams of this loom are pretty thick. I put an arrow pointing to one of the
Oh, I
beams.
see.
How
Yes.
thick that
Yeah.
beam is. Kind of, you know, his. They're trying to describe how big his spear is, but this is a celestial clue because I
Mm-hmm.
just showed you that there's a loom in the heavens. There's weaving that's associated with certain parts of the sky. And in fact, we find spears described as a weaver's beam many times in the Bible, not just with Goliath. Here's in 2 Samuel, a totally different chapter from 1 Samuel, totally different book, different scroll. And there's a different giant, and his staff was like a weaver's beam. In fact, this is the brother of Goliath in this story. And here's another one from 1 Chronicles, where an Egyptian, a man of great stature, 5 cubits high, and in the Egyptian's hand was a spear like a weaver's beam.
Weird beam.
What's going on? Well, maybe that's just a way of describing a really big spear. These are giants who are being described. Goliath is described as being 6 cubits in a span, and a cubit was basically between 18 inches and 21 inches in ancient times. So if we just go on the lower bound, 18 inches, that's a foot and a half, right? 12 plus 6 inches, a foot and a half. So if you're 6 cubits plus a span, which was generally 9 inches or half a cubit. So he's 6 feet plus another 3 feet, because a cubit is a foot and a half. He'd be 9 feet plus another 9 inches. So he's 9'9". That's how tall he is. Is that literal? I don't think it's literal, but I think it's talking
Does
about.
that number, do you think, does 9'9" play any sort of part um
Yeah, I
in
don't know. There's definitely
stars?
number. There's definitely number involved in the.
Yeah, the numerology.
So the system of measure is very ancient too, and it's all tied in. This is all an ancient system that's now been largely broken to pieces. It's been fragmented deliberately. It's been traumatized deliberately by being fragmented, and now all we have is pieces. But I actually suspect that even in the ancient times, this is so ancient, it probably comes from a culture that's before Egypt. There was probably some catastrophe. Even the ancients probably only had remnants of it, but they had more remnants of it than what we have today, because literalist Christians have gone around basically destroying the remnants that were even preserved in the ancient cultures, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it's insane to me.
It is.
That looks like a dog, like getting ready to run, or somebody running a race.
Yeah, so that's the constellation of Hercules. He's got a
Uh-huh.
huge sword that he's brandishing over his head, but you're right. He's got a distinctive deep lunging posture. One
Hmm.
arm is out in front of him, and he's right above Ophiuchus. So here's a picture of David and Goliath from
Yeah,
Peter Paul Rubens. Do you see that distinctive posture that he's drawn,
yeah,
David?
for sure.
He's got his one leg forward, one leg back, deep knee bend, heel raised, and raising a huge sword over his head. And also, he's putting his foot right on basically the head. He's knocked
His
Goliath
temple.
down, yeah, on his temple. He's put his foot there. You can see a little blood on Goliath's forehead because he's already been knocked over by the sling that David threw the sling, and then Goliath crashed to the ground, and then David goes up while Goliath is still alive, but he's basically stunned. And David uses the sword of Goliath himself. He pulls out the giant's own sword and cuts off his head. And so, what's going on here? Look at Hercules. Look at the outline of David.
Hmm.
Look at the size of the sword. It's almost like the sword is too big for Hercules.
Yeah, it's like he's falling over because the sword is so big.
Yeah. And where is he putting his foot?
Yeah, right on the temple.
So
Um,
Goliath, I would argue, is associated with the constellation Hercules, and that's why so many references to weaving and weaver's beams. And even in the story of Samson, at one point, he tells Delilah, "Oh, if you weave my hair into the loom, then I'll become as weak as ordinary men." And then she does that. I don't know why he keeps telling her. She keeps betraying him, but he keeps telling her, he keeps trusting her. But
oh,
and
that
he
happens all the time.
he pulls out, yeah, he
That's very
pulls out
symbolic
the
of most relationships with people.
right. So they're all about us. But the
Right.
weaver's beam, the weaving, the loom is talking about a very specific part of the sky. And so the story of David and Goliath can be shown to be, I'm very confident that David is associated with the constellation Hercules. In fact, I'm going to draw an outline. It's a little bit cut off at the top of the screen, but this is the outline of, hard to tell what it is unless you're very familiar with the constellations, but that is a constellation called Lyra, the lyre. The
Hmm.
lyre is a musical instrument. It's like a little harp. Who plays the harp in the story of David and his friends? David. He's the harpist. He's the psalmist. He's the one who plays the harp. He plays the harp for Saul. Uh,
Hmm.
Saul is beset by his own demons. Saul is constantly doubting himself. Saul is the king who has all these doubts and can't really be an effective king because really he should be out there fighting Goliath, but David goes and slays Goliath for him. And every time Saul is in a terrible rage, David calms Saul by playing the harp or the lyre. So it's very clear. There's so many clues that David is associated with the figure of Hercules. Goliath and most other giants in myth are associated with the figure of Ophiuchus.
I love that music is such a big part of the stars, and like the, biblical and ancient healing too. Because I do sound healing, and it really is bringing you back into harmony, being able to, a lot of, we talked about earlier, of this trauma and fragmentation. It's like you have all these frequencies, and when you have all this fragmentation, all of these things are resonating on different frequencies, and they're going in every different direction. So, and when you do these sacred sounds, and you do these seed syllables, or you do toning, or listening to, a monochord, or it really brings you back to the whole. I think that is what is so healing. So I love that that's also it's in the stars. It's in us. I mean, it's in our DNA. Like
Yeah.
we're made of that. I just
And it's
love
in the
it.
ancient myths. And oh, I was trying to stop sharing. I didn't. I don't, did I stop sharing? Oh, I didn't actually stop sharing. I took down the thing so that that people could see you talking. I was trying to unshare, but anyway.
Oh.
But that's a really powerful point that you just made, because the rhythm, the time, music is about rhythm, and the planets and the stars make these cycles and these rhythms.
Yeah.
So, so let me go back to the slideshow. That's a very important point that you made. And so it's all connected. There was an ancient wisdom, an ancient system was very powerful and very beneficial, and it's about us. So go through the whole drawings to get to the next one, but let me just show one other connection to this giant who's associated with Ophiuchus and associated with weaving. That's a really amazing connection, I think, and that is from the Norse myths. This is from the Elder Edda. There's this is a edition from the 1800s. You can find all these texts. I have links to them in the resources part of my website, but this is a text from the Elder Edda of Norse mythology. The text is called the Vafthrûthnismal, and that's on the left there. Vafthrûthnismal. It means the words. Mal means the words of Vafthrûthnir, who's a Jotun. He's a giant, and his name itself means mighty weaver. He's a giant. He's very wise, but he's somewhat dangerous. And Odin, who's always searching after wisdom, in this poem decides to go. And by the way, poetry is words with rhythm. In fact, almost all the ancient texts, and they're actually all in verse. You can see that this is verse.
Yeah.
And he says, I want to go meet up with that all-wise giant. I need to strive. I need to have a contest of wits with that giant, the one who knows so much of old lore. I want to get some of his wisdom. And his wife Frigg says, oh, don't do that. He's very dangerous. I so dread him. There it is in the Norse, the Alsvina, the all-wise Jotun. She says, be careful when you go meet that mighty weaver of words. So here we have a connection between a story in the Old Testament about David fighting a giant who's associated with at least his spear with a weaver's beam, and here we have supposedly a totally disconnected, culture, the Norse, way up in northern part of the world, seemingly a totally different culture, and yet they have a giant who's associated with weaving. His whole name, Vafthrûthnir, means mighty weaver, powerful weaver. So I would argue that's still
And do
more
you think
evident.
that giant is like the weaving of the illusion of the Matrix, and and combating it and then putting your foot on the head of it to bring that down to the ground, because that is an illusion. It's a falsity. It's weaving a story that is the fabric of the illusion. And so to slay that, you don't have to be mighty in size. You just have to be powerful within and understand that size, no matter how big it is, of the weave, is an illusion.
That's a very insightful, very good insight, because that figure of Ophiuchus is actually associated with wisdom. There are goddesses of wisdom who are associated with Ophiuchus. I can show you that Athena, goddess of wisdom, is associated with Ophiuchus. Solomon, who's the wisest figure in the Bible, is associated with Ophiuchus. In between two pillars, by the way, the pillars of wisdom.
Yeah, the temple's in your head.
That's right. That's right. And so it can be
cool.
It can be wisdom, can be for uplifting and helping. And Solomon actually gets his wisdom by saying, I need help to help the people. I don't have enough. I feel like a little child trying to adjudicate all the, do what's right. And I can't judge rightly for all these people without more wisdom. And God says, okay, I'll give you a wise and understanding heart in order to help the people. So wisdom can be used for helping others. That's what it's supposed to be for, but it can also be used for illusion or deception.
Weaving a story, huh?
Yeah. So there are dangerous figures who are also associated with Ophiuchus, who are like false wisdom.
Right.
Like the sirens in the story of the Odyssey, the sirens who try and lure Odysseus into the rocks give him a promise of wisdom, but it's a false wisdom. They sing to him, hey, come over here, Odysseus, and we'll tell you everything that's ever happened. And we know Odysseus, just like Odin, wants to know. He wants to know everything. He wants to experience everything. And so that's a very seductive song to him. He says, let me go over there. And he's already told his crew to tie him to the mast, and don't whatever he says, don't do it, because and so they're giving him the promise of false wisdom, or wisdom that lures you to your destruction.
Is that the tree of knowledge too, for the snake of coming down from Adam and Eve?
Yeah, so that's all, that whole story is surrounding that whole area of the sky. The Milky Way is right there. Yeah, so the system, and so, that all those lessons that you were mentioning about David and Goliath, that's a story about you. It's a story, and all these stories about Odysseus or Odin searching for knowledge, they're about you, or Inanna going down into the underworld. So that's, I think it's pretty clear evidence that this story is based on the stars. It's, you don't have to believe that there was someone 9 cubits high that.
Right, and this little thing went and beat this giant, and all of a sudden it was a hero, because even that is so egotistical, and it really takes away from what the story is really trying to tell you.
And so some people may say, well, it just speaks to me more powerfully if I think of it as, or if I believe that it really happened. I don't know why it has to have really happened in literal history for it to be powerful, but so
I think it's the worshiping of the lab coat, it's like people need that symbology to be real for them, so they can make sense of the lie that they've been told probably since they were born. I think I know that people would rather feel safe within themselves than to be free, and to explore that this is our wisdom for us to explore ourselves, which sounds egotistical, but really it's anything but, because when you're free yourself, you're more available to outside of yourself for service, of connecting with others and connecting with and showing up in this life. It's like when we don't have that all consumed anyways with ourselves.
Right. And I agree that you don't. So yeah, part of it is, well, if it's not true, then maybe what I believe isn't better than what, see, these stories are, what I just showed is that it's connected to the Norse myths. It's connected to myths from all around the world. All the myths are using the same system.
Yeah.
But one group has said, well, mine's true and everything else is pagan, false, and, given to people by demons or something. And so when you show actually they're all based on the same system, it shows we're all actually closely connected. We're all inheritors of this great ancient inheritance, this legacy that was passed down. But let me also say that doesn't mean that you cannot reconnect. You can't, it doesn't mean that if you take them literally, they can't lead you to reconnect with yourself. In other words,
right, they have power regardless.
You could take it literally and never be told that it's based on the stars and still get the message. So I don't want to say that everybody who's taking it literally is not getting anything good and beautiful in their life from taking it literally, because I know, because I took it literally, and it has truth and beauty, and it's leading you to yourself. But if you're trying to find it externally, Paul says in one of his letters, you foolish Corinthians, don't you know that Christ is within you? That's right. What it's, you're messing up if you make it external, if you it's very easy to turn it on its head if you literalize it. So I don't want to go, because we're almost coming up on 2 hours. If you want to
I'm gonna have you back, honestly. But I think I love David. If we don't get to the next slide, it's fine. I'd love to have you back sometime. But I think what is so incredible, yes, I understand what you're saying, that people that believe literally can have just as much. But I do think that what you're doing, and just having this conversation and listening to you and what other people with understanding and making connections, I think it breaks down the barriers of separation within ourselves, and that we're not so isolated and alone, even in our dogma or religion, and that it doesn't it doesn't matter. We're all meaning the same language, speaking different, using different verbiage, and it is however you get there. I don't believe that you even have to know any of this stuff to have an awakening within yourself. I think that,
Absolutely
it could
not.
happen
Yeah,
if you never heard a podcast or anything about this or read a book. Just
of
connecting with
course.
that is within us.
That's right. It's a tremendous resource that was given to humanity to
Yes.
help. But you can get there without it, but it's there to help people, is what I'm convinced that it is very powerful and very positive. I'm not trying to go around and step on what people believe. I'm very cognizant of that. If
Right.
it's working for you, uh, if you want to call your higher self Jesus, you can do that.
Right.
Okay, and that can work for you. The problem is when it turns into going around and stepping on other people's beliefs.
Right.
So I'm very careful to try not to do that. But the people who are using it to deliberately traumatize, and let's face it, there's a lot of literalism because it turns a lot of the stories on its head. It's like, well, you know, I'm saved and you're not, or I'm part of this tradition and I need to fix your ignorance by giving you my system. It has, and it teaches that you're born in sin and that you have this danger of hell hanging over your head. So for people who are looking for this, I think this is there's people who are looking for this because they have been traumatized and they are looking for it.
And it's
That
powerful message. It's very, very powerful because it just encompasses that, yes, we have this within inside of ourselves. And when people ask, how were the ancients so knowledgeable? It's like they were so connected. This is the dark ages right now, and hopefully people are waking up to that. And I think that, people really are searching for something deeper. So if this resonates with people, awesome. If, whatever. I think that this story is so, you know, transmittable to so many things and applicable in our lives that we can see it in so many ways. But I think that how you're doing it with this, just astrologically, it's just in the stars is phenomenal. I love it. I think it's brilliant. I'm really excited to read your book. I thank you so much for coming and talking to me and sharing about all of this. I think that, you know, it's expansive thinking, and I like that, and it's connective thinking, and I just love that, people can share information and learn from one another like they did in these storytellings that were passed down. And I think that that's coming back, hopefully, at least for the people that want to hear it. I think that it's amazing that they can search for it and it show up. So
and it's and
thank you
it's
very much.
yeah. Well, thank you for having me on, and I'll just say that at the risk of introducing new thoughts at the as I'm saying goodbye, but um, the what you keep coming back to is very important, because when you connect, what trauma does is disconnect you from yourself. But when you're disconnected from yourself, then you're disconnected from your family, you're disconnected from the
Your
human
life force.
community, you're disconnected from the universe, you're
Yeah.
disconnected from the realm of the gods. When you reconnect with self, then you start to be more able to reconnect with others, because now your defensive parts are they're playing their proper role and self is leading, and now you're able to say, that person is so hateful or so angry or so defensive. I wonder what happened to her. Or I wonder what
Right.
happened to him. I, yourself can speak to other, yourself reconnects you with other people, with the universe, with your family, with the disconnection from the self disconnects from everything, and repairing that helps to start to repair all those other connections too. So thank you so
Yeah,
much for having me on.
you are welcome. Oh,
I really
thank you,
appreciate it.
David. I would love to have you back sometime. So I'll keep in contact with you, and we can have you back, and I can read your book, and then we can just talk about your book.
Yeah, well, thanks for purchasing it. I hope you find good things inside,
Oh,
and and um, best wishes with the podcast is the other thing I wanted to say.
oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm gonna just stop the
Great.
recording.